Welcome to this meeting, the first evening of our SWP Revolution, Socialist Workers' Party Revolution 2012. And I'm just going to introduce Melissa Halpin. She's a councillor for Dunleary, in Dunleary West Down, not for them, in it. And she's going to do a talk, Stuffed and Starved, the Politics of Food. So Melissa's going to speak first, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, and hopefully get a good discussion going. So I'll hand you over to Melissa.
Okay, thanks very much, Nicola. Well, when I started reading for this meeting, I was kind of overwhelmed by how the tentacles of food and the politics of food go into every single corner of our world and of our lives, and obviously because it's absolutely vital to keep us going. But I didn't really understand the full importance of it. And just to kind of say at the outset, there's so many things that you could talk about talking about food, but there are very important different things, but I'm not going to be able to cover everything in the speech that I make. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't come up in discussion and that you can't. So I'm not really going to focus on climate change and the impact that is having on food production, but maybe we could discuss that in the discussion, or I'll touch on GM foods, but I just think there are other aspects that are very important to understanding how important food is to capitalism, and how it is part of the workings of capitalism, not only part of how we can work, but the part of the actual workings of capitalism. So that's what I'm not going to talk about. Now I'll tell you what I am going to talk about. And I'm going to kind of try and focus on those kind of aspects. And first of all, really reading about food and where it fits into society does make you realise what an absolutely crazy world we live in. We live in a world where 800 million people are starving and 1 billion people are obese. That is an insane situation. And I will argue in the course of this that actually the solution to both those problems is the same solution. That it is about taking the profit motive and profit out of the whole food industry to ensure that the food that we produce in the world is accessible to everybody in the world. The other thing that I think shows up the madness of it is the whole import-export illogic that is going on. Like, for example, and I found this fact really amazing, that in the rice that is produced in America, the vast majority of it is exported to China, and the rice that's produced in China is exported to America. And when you just think of the air miles that is used for that, and you think of the impact that has on climate change, on the difficulty in producing food, we are talking real madness here. The other thing is biofuels. I mean, we are now burning food to make food. This is what is going on in our society, and that is before you even get onto the food-related diseases. Diabetes and obesity, the diseases related to malnutrition, and the tragic diseases of anorexia and bulimia, where you have the figure that in Ireland 200,000 women mainly are suffering from eating disorders of some kind, and the other fact, the beginnings of the availability of operations to help people stop eating, which is a phenomenon that is going on all around the world. And it's just, these are the kind of things that I think show that the world we live in is crazy, and the way food is positioned in that world is very important, I think, to understand, and it helps clarify the madness of the society we live in. So just to get onto that idea of us living in a world of plenty, where there is enough food in the world, but people are starving, that there is actually enough calories created and there are enough calories available every day for people to live a healthy life. 2,800 calories are available at the moment per person per day around the world. It should be easy, to have those going in to the right people who need them. And so I would argue that it's not because food isn't available or that there are too many people, but because people cannot access the food that is there. They can't afford to buy it. They can't. They're not allowed to have it. And that is becoming a major reality in Ireland today, with the statistics that we've just seen recently of 1 in 10 people in Ireland living in food poverty, and the soup kitchens that are popping up all over the place, and the reports from St. Vincent de Paul of how their Meals on Wheel businesses and all of that are spiralling out of control. Now, the problems that there are blamed on many things, and I think we've just dealt with that idea of shortages. Another argument that is often given out is that there are too many people eating the wrong things. I think that too many people think we need to absolutely scotch, logically, but also it's a very, very dangerous argument. If you say there are too many people, then you start to have to wonder about what you're going to do about that, and that is a very dangerous argument. And the whole thing that you see in the post-war India, where populations were managed, or in China today, that kind of lack of freedom for people to choose to have children and move ahead. So I think that's a very dangerous argument. But also this thing that people are eating the wrong things. So in India, there is an argument that comes up when you start reading about this, that in places like India and China, they're eating too much dairy and too much meat, and that's too difficult to produce and takes too much land up. So if they didn't eat that, then there'd be enough food. And these are the arguments that you come across all the time. And I don't think that these are the root causes of the problems. Nor do I think the impact of climate change is very threatening to food production. But I don't think it's what's causing the starvation in the world today. And when it comes to then the issues of obesity and food disorders, that's often talked about in the context of lack of education or people's individual problems, rather than seeing it as part of a bigger picture. So that's what I want to talk about, how it's much more fundamental than any of those things. It's much more fundamental than the number of people, or it's more fundamental than actually our individual choices. And it's about the kind of society we live in, which is capitalism, which has the free market at the centre of it, and the free market is controlling how food is produced and is delivered around the world. I think we're going to, over the weekend in general, talk a lot about the free market and its control in different areas. But obviously, we will just look at where it's positioned in food, or how it fits with food. And what has happened is that food is seen as food is now a commodity that is bought and sold, speculated on, gambled on, betted on. It features in all the stock markets around the world. So something that is absolutely vital for us to live on day in, day out is a commodity that is, and the fact that it is a commodity distorts the relationship that we have with food. And I think it's that leads to a lot of the difficulty. The difficulties that there are with food. And so I think the solution lies in how food is controlled, and that it needs to be controlled. The control of food needs to be by the producers and the consumers, rather than by the multiples and the big multinationals who are funneling in the profits. But I'll get on to that. I just want to talk first of all about how the role food has played in society over the last 100 years, and kind of look at a few different phases where it has played a very important role, which I think illustrates how central food is to capitalism. Obviously, food has always been important to capitalism, and it has fed the workers that have made capitalism boom. But up until, and this is a slight generalisation, but up until the the Second World War, food was pretty much, people bought local, ate local. It wasn't the vast majority of people. Obviously, the elites had access to foods that came from around the world, but it wasn't. It was pretty much a small time kind of trade in society. But so I kind of start with post World War II, and if you think about it, the Second World War, there was a massive increase in food production in America, for example, because there were 2 million soldiers across the world. There was literally a big drive on to get food production moving, to be able to feed the soldiers. Obviously, the munitions factories also and aren't necessarily going to settle back down to where it was before. And how are they going to use this wealth to benefit themselves, not the farmers, but America in particular? And what you see, and you see they pour the technologies that they had developed in the war start to get poured into the food industry and actually pushing forward these calories that they can create. And you see crops like corn and soybeans move from being a basic food to actually being a raw material that goes into the factories and produces high fructose corn syrup. I keep forgetting about that, which is what is in all the fizzy drinks, all the burgers. It's in pretty much everything. Anything that has a high sugar content, you can be sure that the HFCS stuff is in there. Also, they're producing hydrogenated fats. They're making animal feed out of this. They start to move away from animals actually being in pastures to mass production of meat through feeding them with the products that are made out of the corn and soybeans. So in that period, you see it move up to 70% of the land in the Midwest becomes dedicated to these two products, and it's been churned into people, churned into animals. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Samsara, which has the most horrendous vision of mass production, where you see these pigs in cages, they're just kind of stuck sideways in cages with all the little piglets just suckling on them, and they're unable to move. This is all the kind of mass production of food. It begins after World War II, and starts to be the basis of post-war American imperialism, the Marshall Plan. Because while America is producing 3,500 calories a day, Europe is only able to produce about 2,000, because obviously it's devastated after the war. So the U.S. Marshall Plan in Europe is very much about getting this food across to Europe, creating a relationship and a link between the countries, and a dependency link between countries and the U.S. And I read there's a great quote from the Secretary of State for Agriculture. Oh no, is that no Truman? Where is he now? Sorry, just 1 second. Yes. So yeah, Truman, we must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. More than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate, they are victims of disease, their economic life is primitive and stagnant, their poverty is a handicap and a threat to both them and to more prosperous areas. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and the skill to relieve the suffering of these people. All sounds very nice and very good-meaning, well-meaning, but then you read that was the more palatable part of what he said. The beginning of that is, we must carry out our plans for reducing the barriers to world trade and increasing its volume. Economic recovery and peace itself depend on increased world trade. We will strengthen freedom-loving nations against the dangers of aggression. I hope soon to send the Senate a treaty respecting the North Atlantic Security Plan. In addition, we will provide military advice and equipment to free nations which will cooperate with us in the maintenance of peace and security. And there we have good old American imperialism that we have come to know and not love at all. But food played really central part in that. In Europe, up until Europe gets back on its feet in the beginning of the 50s, and then it moves to the global south and starts to carry out this, create dependencies, pour food in there, allow this this dependency to develop. So by 1968, 79% of all U.S. exports in food are going to the global south. And I'm just going to read one other thing, which is what the Secretary of State for Agriculture under Nixon said. Hungry men listen only to those who have a piece of bread. Food is a tool. It is a weapon in the U.S. negotiating kit. But it was not destined to be forever. Relationships between junkies and dealers never are. So that was this was absolutely the plan up until 1973. You know, the relationship was not forever. With a bang, with the oil crisis, it comes to an end, because the idea of being able to move all this food around the world in the same way when the price of oil is going up and up becomes much more difficult. So the new strategy that comes in after this is what's known as the Green Revolution, which is, rather than send the food to the global south, there was the development of fertilizers, the development of hybrid seeds, the development of I suppose the precursors to GM foods, the development of all of those that are then sold to the global south, and to get them producing for themselves. This was the Green Revolution, and obviously to have the global south able to produce enough food for themselves was a certain improvement, but it had a huge cost in terms of ecology, and in terms of fossil fuels, and in terms of the dependency on these new kind of crops that were destroying the ecosystems in the developing world, and starting the whole debt problem, because to buy all of this from the US, they needed to borrow money. And this is on a national scale. So you see the national debt, the debt problems of countries in the developing world, but also on an individual scale, where individual farmers are encouraged to take out loans. They'll be able to survive. They can take out the loans. They'll be able to get their farm going, get their farm moving. And you see all through that period, and from that period on, the absolute tragedy of suicide in farmers all across the global south. The rates are absolutely phenomenal. I don't have them to hand, but this book, Stuffed and Starved, is a great book to read about, and it gives you all those kind of facts. But the tragedy of the suicide of small farmers is really just it's another another way the U.S. imperialism has caused havoc across the world. And so just to kind of bring us on from there, this debt cycle, and at the end of the 1970s, the moving in of the IMF and the World Bank into the developing world, and getting them, developing that debt issue. And it didn't. So they we see what the IMF is doing today. It's it's the exact same as they did in the 1970s in the developing world, where the public sector needs to be de-bloated. The food aid, all through in India after independence, and right through until the IMF and the World Bank were involved, they had a public distribution system which offset some of the horrors of what would happen if a crop failed one year, or what would happen if there was if you didn't produce enough on your farm to be able to feed your family. There was a public distribution system where people could access emergency food. All that had to be cut out. If they were going to get loans from the IMF and the World Bank, these had to go in India, in Mexico, in everywhere. And so the countries in the developing world are now in debt up to their ears, but they're able to produce food. So what do they do with this? They sell it back to America because they need the dollars so that they can pay off their debt. So in this period, the developing world become net exporters of food and are not able to feed their populations because the food is going back across the world, again adding to the climate problems that only kind of turned we're living with the consequences of now. In the subsequent decades, when the post-war boom is truly over, and I do think this is important. Those years after the boom, up until the 70s, making money out of all of this was, free. It was easy. There was money abounding all over the place. But as capitalism begins to run into problems in the 70s and run into problems then in the recession at the end of the 70s, the need for the superpowers to grab their profits everywhere they can becomes more and more important for them. And you see the beginning or the setting up of the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, which is the agreement between the US and Canada and Mexico about trade. The first time really there was a trade agreement that linked such a poor country with two very rich countries. And the plan was obviously that the rich countries would benefit Mexico would be lifted up. But what actually happens is the absolute opposite, and the rape of Mexico by both Canada and North America in their drive to create more profits. The World Trade Organization comes into being around this time as well, and is about setting up those kind of trade agreements around the world, of which there are many. You also see at this time speculation come into food, and food being bought and sold on or food speculation happening in stock exchanges. That food is something that people are betting on, are gambling on, and are distorting, and as such the price gets distorted as a result of that. And this is when you also see the growth in the human cost of all of this, which is the millions starving in a world of plenty. Because there's a big difference between millions starving when the world can't produce food in previous centuries, but when the world is producing so much food and people are starving, this is the horror of all of this. But it also presents a problem for the powers that be as well, because when people are starving, they start to get pretty bloody angry. And Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, got its name from a British imperialist at the end of the 1800s. Was talking about a food riot that I saw. I was in the East End of London yesterday and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which was just a cry for bread, bread, and on my way home I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. If you want to, and I think what he was saying here was, if you want to avoid unrest, you need to deal with the food problem, and in 1895 the way of dealing with that was imperialism. So that's what he's talking about. That conundrum for the powers that be is something that they have constantly tried to solve in different ways as capitalism has developed. How they can keep people with enough food to not revolt and yet get as much profit out of it at the same time. And it's not always been easy to solve, and as capitalism goes more and more into crisis, it becomes more and more difficult for them to solve, because they want to keep their profits moving and at the same time don't want to how am I doing with time?
You have 25 minutes down.
Oh God, okay. So that I think is why we have seen over the last decade the big resistance and big protests and food riots in a number of different areas, starting with the fantastic protests in Seattle in 1999 against the World Trade Organization, which was against how the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, that those free trade associations were destroying the lives of so many. We saw them again against the WTO in 2003, or in Seoul. I can't remember when it was. I remember the Korean farmers had amazing protests against a big WTO conference that was on there. And then more importantly, and I'd argue most importantly, since 2006, as the credit crunch arrived, the profiteers looked for other places other than property to find their profits, and food became hugely important. And the speculation on food, when I was talking earlier about the in the kind of 1970s, it first starts to become speculated on. But when they started speculating in the 1970s, somewhere at the Chicago Grain Exchange, which is the biggest food stock exchange in the world, actually they were speculating on the future prices of food, but there was still food was being delivered in the process. There was still if they were speculating on the price of a kilo of grain in the autumn, there would be somewhere a kilo of grain that they were speculating on. The speculation now, what's happening in the Chicago Grain Exchange, is 90% of what happens is there is no product. It is just the back and forth of gambling on the price of food, on the future price of food, and making money out of that. And this has caused the prices to absolutely soar. Rice in 2003, $198 a ton. 2007, $323 a ton. 2008, $1,000 a ton. Right? And you see that with other grains, with bread, with corn, and the similar kind of hikes. And what that has resulted in is these protests. There's a very impressive list of food protests that have gone on over the last couple of years in Bangladesh, in Burkina Faso, in Cameroon, in Egypt, in Haiti, in Ivory Coast, in Yemen, in Indonesia, in Morocco, in Senegal, in Mauritania, in Guinea, in Jordan, in Uzbekistan, in Honduras, in Mozambique, and in India. Massive protests demanding food, demanding better wages in order to be able to deal with the fact that food prices have gone up, and some of them, against free trade associations. But I think one of the most important ones in that list is Egypt, because the protests we saw in Egypt in 2008 in Mahla about food prices is the beginning of the revolution that we're still witnessing in Egypt today, and the role that the food prices played in that is very important, because it was the thing that pulled the Egyptian people who had been stamped upon by Mubarak for decades and decades, could not take not having bread, not being able to buy bread, and they came out in the streets, and it was the beginning of the fantastic fight back that we saw. So I'll just try and finish up now, just to say that I think that what I'm trying to say is that food is not only vital to humanity, but has also played an absolutely crucial role in capitalism. And by it being bought and sold as a commodity, rather than seen as just a basic necessity, it has caused the starvation that we see in the world, and has also created a distorted relationship between people and food. And I think it's that distorted relationship between people and food, because we're so far away from it. We're so far from the production of food. It's that kind of relationship that causes the psychological and medical problems that we see as well. So what are the solutions? And maybe we can discuss these a bit more. There are lots of individual solutions out there that people move towards, like growing your own, like eating local, like eating only organic food, never touching junk food, and trying to stay away, not buying the multiples, not And I'm in favour of all of those. I think we shouldn't have to eat junk food. We shouldn't have to make choices. We shouldn't have our choices impoverished by the society that we live in. But I don't think that those individual solutions are going to solve the problem, because it is far too intrinsically linked with capitalism. And until we take the profit motive out of food production, I don't think we're going to see a solution to that problem. And that means doing what the workers in Mahalaal did, taking to the streets and actually taking it further than just a demand for food. And it's funny, when you think about the Russian Revolution, the first demand was bread, peace and land, and that led to the overthrow of the society at the time. Food not only plays a very vital role in the profits, it can also play a vital role in how we mobilise and start to fight back against the system that is destroying our bodies and our enjoyment of what should be a daily enjoyment that we could have.
Oh, yes, sorry, I have to.
Oh, you have it. Go on.
Because it happened last week in, I think it was in Wexford, the fishermen in Wexford, they went out to sea, they broke the idea that there was a ban, they brought the fish into the quayside, they invited people to come and take it for free, because the fish that they had, they were supposed to dump back into the sea. So they brought it on land, and people were the tip. Now, that's what you need to continue, but there was only one incident of it.
It's good to end the discussion. It's good to end the discussion. I'm hearing a bit of fight back. I've just been handed an announcement. If anybody here is looking for accommodation, the march tomorrow at 4 o'clock, so make sure that you get the insert, because there have been changes to the timetable. Now I'll let Melissa back in.
Okay, thanks, Nicola, and thanks to you all for contributions, because I thought it was all very interesting, because it's such a wide topic and there's so much you can talk about. So thanks very much. And I'll just start on the last point, which is about fishing. I completely agree with you. What the EU, because when I was talking about all the free trade agreements, really the EU was one of the first of them, and its impact on fishing in this country has been absolutely disgraceful. We were talking to a couple of fishermen the other night out in Dunleary about the problems they're having, but they mentioned the figure of 160 billion euros worth of fish have been taken out of Irish waters. It's another example of just selling off we're giving away everything in this country. We're giving away our natural resources. We're giving away but I do think small farmers in Ireland have fared badly, and that it was, the big farmers did quite well out of a lot of deals. And it is interesting to see the farmers' protest Ed was talking about the recent one, but the one last year, there was a very big farmers' protest last year, and their main target was Tesco's and all the supermarkets for the prices that they were making them sell their milk for. And that was a very radical move because the farmers' protests in Ireland are, you're never quite sure which way they are. Are they progressive or are they regressive?
No, they're only trying to figure out the market. They want their slice of cake, that's all.
But some of them, I think that battle against
a lot of work if you want the socialists to infiltrate the IFA, for example.
But I think there was a very progressive mood on that protest, not this year, the year before, of individual farmers who were recognising the rule of the multinational in there.
They talking about the middleman was getting too much of space.
And it's interesting if you look on a global I don't know can you see that graph, the hourglass?
Yeah.
This is the food industry in Netherlands, Germany, France, UK, Austria, and Belgium, right? So you have at the top the 3.5 million farmers, and at the bottom the 160 million consumers, and they all go through the tiny little neck of 110 what they call buying desks. So it goes down, narrower and narrower, and all the money is made in here. All the money is made in the middle. The consumers and the farmers, the small farmers, pay the prices, and that's squeezing, and it's squeezing through there, and they're pulling out every cent of profit in the middle with these buying desks. 110 of them in those 6 countries that are in control of all of the food. And I think that's the Aldi and Lidl thing that you brought. I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at, but are they? I think you were asking, are they going to, once they get a hold, their prices will be the same?
Young generation of people that we have now, like sons and daughters, going out and send it out this way.
Yeah.
Because they're buying the cheap packets. If you've got middle aisle, I think in their Aldi's, where most aisles they sell things at 29 cents a bag.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, people are saying this is good nutritional food, and Aldi are good. What I'm saying is, down the road, they will become the next digital place.
Yeah, they're fighting for their market space, and like
they want their share of the market.
Yeah,
and they're corrupt the next generations.
Yeah, and they're fighting to win it, and capitalism is all about kind of the monopolies getting, trying to take over larger grabs of the share of the market. But
private largesse. Public loss, private largesse.
Yes, exactly.
So what it's called, is it?
The Irish famine. I was trying to find. There's another graph in that somewhere about famines in the. I think it is. I did say at the beginning there was quite a generalisation to just start at World War II, and obviously the role of food in imperialism was also important before that. But I was trying to just kind of take it in a kind of a more modern sense. But I do think, like in every bit of imperialism through the years, when you think of the East India Tea Company and the plantations in the Caribbean, and coffee, the growing of coffee, and the slavery was based on importing huge amounts of people to make coffee for the elites of France and of Europe and of America as well. So food has always been important. And I was reading recently that in those early days of imperialism, the French aristocracy used to transport their wine to the Caribbean and back before they drank it, because they thought it gave it an extra special flavour. So the idea that, I just thought that was such an example of absolute just having too much, really. I just don't believe for a second that a bottle of wine going to the Caribbean and coming back changes. It would change the same where it was sitting, anyway. So food has always played a role, and I think the Irish famine, the absolute, I grew up in school learning that was about potatoes, and a lot of people learned that was about potatoes, and it was years later I was reading a book by John Newsinger on the British Empire, and he actually calls the Irish famine the single biggest atrocity of British imperialism, and I was so gratified to read that, because it was absolutely horrendous. The 2 million people died, and 2 million people emigrated, and 1.5 million people died in the space of 3 years, while there was food in the country, while there was food being taken out of the country. I'll just finish up. Is that it?
Well, I was just going to say that goes to my point. It's the whole mindset.
I'm coming to your point.
That's not a freaking famine. That was done on purpose.
Yeah.
Just because we're running out of time, we're actually over time now. Just allow Melissa to finish.
Very quickly, the diet industry. Absolutely, it drives me insane, and I hate the fact that when you look at the salt content or the sugar content in the low fats, they're much higher. So you take out the fat, but you give people sugars. Every single low fat milk has way higher sugar in it, which leads me to the idea of what they're thinking of bringing in of the fat tax that they're talking about, which I think is an absolute disgrace. You cannot. That they're suggesting putting taxes on foods that have high fat, high sugar, high salt content. If you want to stop that, tax the bloody producers. Don't tax the people who are buying it. You go into any shop and look at the fat content and look at the price, and look at the fat content and look at the price. It is so often cheaper. The cheap cereals, Kellogg's cereals, all have high salt content. What are they doing putting bloody salt into our cereals? Why do we need the salt? And they're the cheaper cereals, So fat tax is not a solution to this, and I think if it does come in the budget, it should be something that we give out yards about. It's an absolute disgrace. It's about taxing people with with less money, and with 1 in 10 in food poverty, it'll mean they'll eat less, they'll eat less, they'll eat worse. It's not acceptable. The pretend food and the wastage of food, I agree with it. It's so nice to see a dirty carrot that isn't bright orange, and I mean,
funny shape.
Yeah, or a funny shape, or bananas when we were in Brazil this summer, and in the fruit in the market, the bananas were dead straight, or small and kind of funny looking, and that's the way food is supposed to look. It's not supposed to look like these perfect little things, I don't believe anyway. On the idea of anorexia and it being the problem being in our heads, I think that anorexia is a very difficult disease to understand, and I'm not a medic at all. But as I understand the world, I think Marx had a theory called alienation, that because of the way our world is, and because of our lack of control over how the world works, over how the very basics are produced in society, we are detached from it. The relationship between us and the world is distorted, and it leads to all sorts of distortions. Whether it's about how you buy, how you act, how you work, how you do whatever you're doing during the day, or how you feel about yourself. I mean, if you look at how women's bodies are splayed across the world, are used as a commodity, how women themselves are bought and sold, how the size and shape of somebody in a magazine compared to the actual size and shape of women, it is so distorted, and it leads to a very, very difficult way of looking at the world. And I think that, not being a medic, I think that is part of what leads to things like anorexia and bulimia, and I think that can be solved. I think people do need help, but we won't really solve it unless we get away from that distorted relationship between humanity and deduction. And that's about ending capitalism. And there were other things, but I'm being told
we are being told to get out. But listen, it's a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much.